Just as I said this evening, we are blessed to have with us several ex-atheists who are going to be telling us about their journey to faith in Christ. Our first guest is Dr. Gunter Bechly, who's a paleontologist in Germany, who's done a webinar actually for us before on the implications of the fossil record for evolutionary theory. So do you want to kick us off, Gunter, and just go right ahead?
Yeah, sure. So hello, everybody. As Jonathan said, I'm a paleontologist. I'm working at the Natural History Museum in Stuttgart as a curator for amber and fossil insects. So I'm also an evolutionary biologist, but actually, meanwhile, interested and supporting intelligent design theory, and since recently senior fellow of Center of Science and Culture of the Discovery Institute. So I have become a theist very late in my life, in my late 40s, and a Christian just a few years ago, with about 50. It was not a very straight process. It was kind of on-off relationship till my final conversion. So I started as a child of the 60s, growing up in a middle-sized town in Germany. And my parents were completely agnostic. They never talked about religion. We never talked about God, never went into church. I was not baptized. In Germany in this time, we still had obligatory religious education, so you had to decide either Protestant or Catholic. Or you could opt out, but nobody did opt out except me. So in a class of about 30 pupils, I was the only one who opted out of religious education and was a kind of outcast, the heaven of the village. And never went to church service until very late in my life. So I had no relationship to religion whatsoever. I was only interested in science, in nature, and I even came in my adult years, my 20s and 30s, to despise religion. I considered it a silly medieval or ancient superstition. I was very much anti-Christian. I considered Christianity as a religion basically for weaklings who are afraid of death. I had people like Dawkins as my heroes, because I didn't have the philosophical background then to see the shallowness of their arguments. I visited my first church service when I married a Catholic girl from Austria, and I went with her to church. I found it quite boring. It didn't convert me. On the contrary, I then baptized, but not because I believed in Christianity, but because we wanted to have a church marriage. It was also for the family, and I liked the idea of a church marriage, a pompous marriage, but I didn't really believe the stuff. So this family relation to a Catholic family didn't convert me. What started my journey was interest in modern physics. I had a popular science level interest all of my life in different natural sciences, also modern physics, so implications of relativity theory and quantum mechanics, string theory, cosmology, and so on. So I read the books of people like Feynman or later Brian Greene and all this stuff. And what I realized after a while is that these modern results of physics have philosophical implications. So I started an interest in philosophy of time. I also started an interest in philosophy of mind. And I realized there are problems with the materialist worldview that I had for several decades of my life, that I was basically rooted in a kind of 19th century worldview of a clockwork universe, and that there are problems that are not easily to be solved or are impossible to solve in a completely materialistic framework. So one of the problems would be causality. What I realized, for example, is if you accept the theory of Einstein, relativity theory, and the interpretation in terms of space-time, then I realized, well, then everything exists, past, present, and future exists basically per se in this four-dimensional space-time block, and the origin of life is just one geometrical point at one end of the space-time block, and dinosaurs somewhere in the middle, and then here we are, and the extinction of all life maybe is some other geometrical point in this space-time geometry. But there is not really a flow of time. There is no flow from a cause to an effect. So what I always thought that, let's say, evolutionary theory explains why there is the diversity and complexity of life wouldn't really work in this kind of static view of time. So that was one point where I realized there is a problem, and if you accept all of modern science, you get some problems. Other problems were, of course, with the philosophy of mind, and the question, how can you explain that you get phenomenal consciousness from just matter in motion, elementary particles bumping together? What is the explanation for a persistent, enduring self, problem of free will, and so on? So I became interested in philosophy and metaphysics, and I started a kind of philosophical journey that took me more than 10 years. I soon realized materialism is incoherent. So like many people, I first started with Eastern thought and delved into monistic or non-dualist Advaita Vedanta Hinduism and its New Age relatives. So I also explored Ken Wilber's integral theory, some of this quantum crockery stuff of let's say, Amit Goswami, for example, who propose a kind of quantum-related interpretation of objective idealism. And I encountered a name quite frequently, especially in Wilber's writings, and that is the name of Alfred North Whitehead, who co-authored the Principia Mathematica together with Russell, and invented this so-called process philosophy with its side branch process theology. And I had this impression that maybe it's worthwhile to study process philosophy. There is something interesting about this stuff. And this also took me several years, and I read a lot of books about it. It became even kind of specialist for Whiteheadian process philosophy, private specialist, not in published terms. And but finally also realized that there are problems that cannot be resolved, incoherences of the system. And after several years and 1.5 meters of space in my bookshelf of books about process philosophy that I read, I was quite frustrated with spiritual philosophy. So I had a fallback into materialism. Again, explored people like Daniel Dennett and Tegmark's version of the multiverse, kind of mathematical multiverse hypothesis. And after a while, I recognized there are also problems that cannot be resolved, especially all theories that imply an infinite multiverse have this freak observer problem, or better known as the Boltzmann brain problem, but even more important, the so-called measurement, the measure problem of cosmology, how to divide infinity to get finite probabilities. So I recognize this is also no viable solution. I then explored another branch of metaphysical philosophy, and that was John Leslie's modern version of Neoplatonism, wedded to idealism. After a while, I recognized that there are problems inherited by Platonism, like the third man problem, problems related to the fact that he has to imply a B theory of time, a static theory of time as well. I was again frustrated, was for a while not interested in philosophy anymore, thought it's not leading anywhere, but couldn't stop it for a longer time. Then explored deism, came from deism to theism, general theism, and then of course you have an incentive to explore Christianity. So by theism, I was convinced very quickly when I listened to a lot of YouTube debates, for example, by people like Lane Craig, by philosophical arguments like the Kalam argument or Leibniz argument, also the ontological argument, the fine-tuning argument of cosmology, all those arguments for general theism. And then I explored, of course, the different religions, soon realized that there are good historical reasons for the reliabilities of the Gospels, and if you already accept, because of philosophical arguments, that theism is true, then the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ is the best explanation for the historical evidence. So I arrived more or less accepting Christianity, but then had this on-off relationship because I had problems with parts of Christianity. So first problems I had were Old Testament atrocities, and I grappled with this issue for quite a while. Then second problems were miracles, and I still remember some debates I had with Jonathan about this issue before I really accepted that theism, of course, makes miracles, the a priori probability for miracles greater than 0 at least. And my final problems with accepting Christianity were, one, pride, accepting that I'm a sinner myself. And the last problem was, well, we have 2 little baby boys, and accepting that you at least should love Jesus and God most and even more than your family. That was one of the final stumbling blocks. But because of, I was convinced finally by Christianity, not because I was raised in a Christian surrounding, not because of scripture, believing the Bible, but purely of rational arguments, evidential apologetics arguments, philosophical arguments, metaphysical arguments. I also started then exploring Thomism and shifted from, let's say, this more personalist theism to classical theism, including divine simplicity and so on. And recently even consider biblical Christianity, including, let's say, its implication for accepting Genesis 1 to 11, maybe as not so metaphorical. So that would basically be my journey. I was convinced by arguments and came from atheism to accept Christianity. And if you accept Christianity and believe that Jesus was God and Jesus vindicates the Old Testament, then you have the whole package. So that's how I became a Christian.
Thank you, Dr. Bechly. Daniel, we'll just go straight on to you. Do you want to maybe give us 10 to 15 minutes on your testimony?
Yeah, I'll try and get 10 minutes. That was really interesting from Gunter. So yeah, I'm Daniel Rodger. I teach applied health sciences at London South Bank University. And like Gunter, I wasn't brought up in a Christian home, family or anything. So I was brought up in a single parent family, quite poor and quite sort of dysfunctional, and didn't have any sort of Christian education growing up at all. And so just kind of embraced normal sort of British sort of cultural criticisms of religion in general and Christianity. And so I probably consider myself a sort of atheist by the time I was 13, something like that, 13, 14. Just like most of my friends, I didn't have any Christian friends. I knew a few Muslims, and my only sorts of engagement really with the question was, I remember being in a school science class and a friend sort of saying to me, he's like, well, what do you think about God, the idea of God? And I said, well, I quite like the idea of there being a God, but I just don't think there's any evidence or merit in believing that that's the case. So I wasn't a sort of Thomas Nagel-like figure who doesn't want the universe to be like that. I would given the choice, I would prefer to live in a universe as an atheist where there is this sort of omnipotent, omniscient God who initiated this sort of rescue plan to save sinful humanity, but also very aware that just because I want something, I prefer something to be true, doesn't mean that it is. And if I didn't think there was any merit or reason to embrace that. And so that was probably the only sort of time I've really pondered the idea of Christianity, just because of my friendship group and schooling. It was just sort of Christianity is a bit stupid, and anyone who believed in God was a little bit dim, really, and a bit boring. But by no means was I sort of I didn't sit at home and read Nietzsche or anything. So I wasn't, I hadn't, spent years reading atheistic philosophy or anything particularly anti-Christian. I just embraced the common criticisms of Christianity that me and my friends sort of talked about, and I kind of, absorbed being in, skeptical post-Christian culture. So finished school, did a bit rubbish at school, got expelled from my A-levels and just went to work, really, and was just spent my time having fun and getting drunk and having more fun, really. My grandparents then became Christians about maybe sort of 15 years ago. And I'd often go and do a bit of work around the house. So I did a bit of labouring and gardening and stuff like that. And they'd always talk to me about Jesus. And I'd just tell them to sort of F off, really. I saw no merit to it, and it was a bit silly. But I sort of got to a point where I thought, well, I know it's nonsense already, but I should probably spend a bit of time being a bit more rigorous in my thinking and sort of research. So it's around that time, sort of maybe 12 years ago, that I started looking into Christianity and different religions, and trying to become a slightly more intellectually fulfilled atheist. But this is obviously prior to the God delusion, probably a year before, really. So I didn't have Dawkins' sort of rigorous philosophical criticisms of Christianity to appeal to. But I just looked at different religions. I kind of ruled out the non-monotheistic religions because Hinduism and these sorts of things, you get another opportunity. It seemed more pertinent to kind of look at the three main monotheistic religions of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, because obviously if they're true, you only get this life to really get yourself sorted out. So I spent the majority of my time looking at those, and eventually sort of began reading enough sort of philosophy and Christian theology and other defenses of other religions to kind of realise that perhaps I had been slightly overzealous in my sort of conclusions about theism, at least. And I guess I sort of got to the point where I realised that you didn't have to be stupid to believe in God. And so then I thought, well, I kind of, for other reasons I'm not going into now, sort of ruling out Islam. Just started reading the Bible, and very much, I guess, becoming sort of drawn to the person of Jesus, just sort of got to the point where the Christian worldview very much just started to seem to make more and more sense in terms of as a worldview. I guess it just seemed like it had more sort of explanatory power in terms of human nature, morality, my own nature and desires and struggles, and it just seemed to make much more sense. And I very much just got to the point where I realised that I had been worshipping a sort of I think, let me clarify, I think we're all natural worshippers. I think we all worship something. I think when we don't worship God, it's not that we don't worship anything, we just find a substitute God. And I think my own pleasure had become my God substitute. And I think the more I listened to the words of Jesus and reading the rest of the New Testament, just becoming very aware that I was kind of guilty of idolatry, and that I made a god out of my own pleasure and autonomy, and just realised that being convicted about my own sin and need for God, I just repented and started following Jesus, and that was about 11 years ago. And God just completely transformed me from a lazy, rude, nightmarish sort of person, and just through his love and forgiveness, just really sort of transformed me as a person. And that was 11 years ago. So I kind of went back to school, and got a job, got working, got married, and as I said, now sort of teaching and things, and still very much challenged by the gospel and just trying to follow Jesus sort of day by day. So there's lots more I could say, but that's sort of a brief sort of summary. It'd be wrong to sort of paint myself as some sort of previously philosophically and scientifically minded atheist. I was just a normal English working class bloke who's been transformed by the love of God, really. And I think there are good reasons for the Christian worldview to be true. Essentially, I want to believe what's true, and I believe the gospel is true, and the Christian worldview makes much better sense than its alternatives. So.
All right, thank you, Daniel. Let's go over to Liz Mooney from Newcastle upon Tyne. Go ahead.
Hi everyone, I'm Elizabeth from Newcastle, and I would say I became a Christian about 18 months ago. It was a whirlwind journey for me. It all happened very quickly. I was baptised as a child, but that was because that was what you do. It was sort of expected, and we went to church Christmas and Easter because that was what you do. But God was never mentioned at home. I was an atheist. I went to church because I liked singing hymns, and I'd never really given it too much thought. I didn't really have any strong philosophical arguments or anything for atheism besides my own intuition. Basically, the main thing I knew about Christianity was that it required a virgin birth and somebody rising from the dead. These two things were scientifically impossible, and therefore I rejected Christianity. I just thought it was ridiculous, and quite similar to Daniel, I came to the conclusion that you couldn't be clever and believe in Christianity. There was one girl in my school who was a Christian, but everybody thought she was a bit weird for that belief. We thought she was a lovely person, but the Christianity bit we just sort of left on the side. So my sort of atheistic worldview only began to be challenged when I went to university at the start of 2013, September 2013, because when I got to university, I found that several of the people I became friends with were Christians, which confused me because I went to Cambridge University, so the people there were clearly very, very clever. And yet they also believed in Christianity. They believed in a God. So I sort of let that go for a year and a bit. Thought this is just a part of their life, which is a bit weird. I'll just put it on the side and pretend it's not there. But after sort of a year and a half, it just kept being driven home to me. They had Bibles in their rooms. They had a few quotes from the Bible sort of on their walls. They went to church 2 or 3 times a week. They seriously believed in this. So I suppose I sort of thought, I'm going to investigate Christianity. I know that I'm right. I know that Christianity is false. I know there isn't a God, just because that's intuitively correct. So I decided to investigate Christianity. I mentioned this to a friend who eventually persuaded me to attend an Alpha course to investigate the basics of Christianity. I I missed the first 2 sessions because I wasn't really convinced I could be bothered. So I missed the 2 sessions about Jesus. But that did mean that the first session I went to was about the historical reliability of the Gospels. And that just blew me away, because I was studying history at university, specifically sort of early medieval British history, and the historical reliability of the Gospels is greater than anything I was basing my degree on. And that just blew me away. It's sort of like, if you're going to believe Julius Caesar was a real person who took part in his Gaelic wars, then you sort of have to believe that Jesus was at least a real person. So that was a really key turning point for me, because I sort of just assumed that the Gospels and the Bible were just created hundreds of years after the events, and they just couldn't be relied upon. And then pretty quickly, somebody explained to me that science can't actually disprove the supernatural, which meant that my big objection to Christianity, the virgin birth, somebody rising from the dead, were no longer valid, because science couldn't disprove them, as I had assumed. So this grabbed my attention, and in a couple of months I began, the Alpha course became the most important thing for me to attend. I began reading so many books. I was questioning just everybody who would listen. Probably my friends were just brilliant in answering any question I had, and I was really struck by the fact that they were prepared to take time out of their days to just talk to me. We were all really busy, but if I ever had a question, they would just come and sort of chat to me about it. And I think the thing that really convinced me was when I read Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ, because by the time his brain works in a very similar way to mine. He goes through all of the questions. He just logically examines: is the Bible reliable? Did Jesus claim to be God? And did the resurrection happen? And when I finished that book, I just sort of thought, I cannot think of any intellectually satisfying way to say that Christianity is not true. So in sort of a month or two, my view had completely switched from Christianity is intellectually unsupportable to it's intellectually unsupportable to say Christianity is false. So I sort of came at Christianity from the reverse direction, as in I believed in Jesus before I believed there was a God, which I know sounds a bit weird, but looking at the historical evidence for Jesus and his resurrection, I felt I had no choice but to accept that the resurrection had occurred. And therefore, I had to believe in God, because I needed some supernatural agent who was going to bring the resurrection about. I've since done lots of reading for the independent evidence of God, the fine-tuning argument, the cosmological argument, etc. And those together built up a very strong cumulative case. But initially, my belief in God was purely based on the fact that the resurrection seemed to be so true. So for me, there was no moment where I felt there must be more to life than this. There was no moment where I thought, oh, it would be nice if there was, I wish there was a God. I simply examined the facts, examined the evidence, and logically came to the conclusion that if I was going to be intellectually honest, I had to accept Christianity was true. And I have not got, the more I've read since that day about 18 months ago, the more I've read, the more I've studied, the more certain I've become in my faith. So that's my testimony.
Thank you, Liz. Let's go over to Chris from Canada. Chris, can you?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan. Can I be heard?
Yep, go ahead.
Excellent, thank you very much. I just want to thank Elizabeth, Daniel, and Gunter so far for giving their testimonies. They are very inspiring. And I'm just hoping that I can be as inspiring as well. So to get started off, yes, I was an atheist. Yes, I was one of the worst kind. I'm not proud of who I used to be, but I am proud of who I am today. And I have no problem telling this story because God is the one that saved this sinner. Starting off in my life, I was an atheist. I was into a lot of criminal activity. I do have, now getting rid of, I have 8 assault charges, 5 assault causing bodily harm. I have drug charges. I was involved with gangs, things to this nature. I was not a very nice person to anyone. Throughout my life, a lot of times we had this slang word for where I'm from. It's called to burn someone. What that is somebody would give me an amount of money expecting something in return. I would then tell that person, if you want your money back, you're going to have to fight for it. So that's what we used to say by burning somebody. So understanding that I was one of the worst possible people in society, not believing that there was a God, not even caring if there was a God at all, leads me to how I come to the realization there is a God. And this story starts with me and 20 to 25 of my friends sitting around a campfire having a few drinks. We were all conversating, and we thought it would be fun to pour gasoline into a cup and throw the gasoline onto the fire. And we did it 2 or 3 times, or maybe, about 6 or 7 times, and the fire went up. Oh yay, it was nice and bright. But the 8th or 9th time that my friend threw the gas onto the fire from the cup, the last time it actually retracted back to the cup. So the cup was on fire in his hand, and he dropped the cup at his feet. Well, the gas can was roughly about 2 feet to the left on the left side of my friend, but there must have been gas that it was sprinkled along the gas along the grass over to the gas can. So immediately there was a line of fire went right over to the gas can, and the gas can was engulfed in flames. And my friend turned and he grabbed and he turned and he threw. And now, before I finish the story, my friend's backyard on the left and on the right and directly behind his house was full of like shrubs and like a cornfields and things to this nature. So it was like a farm field. So when he threw it towards the house where we were all running. And the gas can hit me. And all he could say is, "Oh no, Chris." And the gas sprayed up and down my back, and immediately I was engulfed in flames. And I eventually, not right at the time, but I did stop, drop, and roll. And when I stopped, I had 23 to 20-year-old men standing over top of me. I had 3 of them hosing me down with the hose from my friend's house. And they were crying. And I didn't understand why they were crying when they were standing above me, putting me out. And they said that it was like real TV. And I'm not sure if many people are frequented with that TV show. But when somebody's running away from you, all you can see is flames. You can't even see the physical person anymore. And that's what it was like with me. So it got to the point where I went into the bathroom. I was in a tub. My friend, Pauline, love her to the day I die, give me a ride to the hospital. And on the way to the hospital, I just asked God. I said, "God, if you're there, just give me one sign. And from that moment, I will continue on the walk." The gift I got was healing. I was burnt all over my body. The doctor said that it would never heal. They actually took a patch from my leg where my shorts were burned into my body, and they replaced it with another part of skin from another part of my body. And the doctors told me it would never go away. And I'm here today to tell you that I have no scar on my body. Not one. And this could only be by the grace of God. And this is what brought me to knowing that there is a God. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Chris. And just finally, last but not least, we have Mark McGee from Alabama. Go ahead, Mark.
Thank you, Jonathan. Boy, it's really neat to hear all the testimonies. I love how creative God is. and how he leads people to himself. It's just fascinating to me. I became an atheist in my freshman year in college. I was in college for journalism. I spent a little over 40 years as a journalist, retired about 7 years ago. And I tell you that because the fact that I was a journalist and that's the way I thought and was my experience, that really helped me a lot in the process of becoming a Christian. I was raised in a Christian home by Christian parents, went to church all the time. But Christianity and belief in God to me was just something that belonged to my parents. It was something I had to do because it was part of our lifestyle. Going to church all the time was what we did. But I never made it mine. When I became about 10 years old, there was a lot of pressure on kids my age to be born again, to have to make a profession of faith. All of my friends went to churches. I didn't know anybody who wasn't a Christian. So I went forward, told the pastor I wanted to be saved, filled out the card, took some classes, was baptized. I did the things that in our church you did to become a member of the church. But it was never mine. It was never something personal. I was very observant. I like to watch people, ask people questions, curious. And I noticed that a lot of the leaders in our church would do things that were opposite of what they said, hypocrisy. So as a young boy, I just observed hypocrisy among people who called themselves Christians. When I was 12, I started studying yoga, and that's when I encountered my first non-Christian religion, and that was Hinduism. Studied that about a year, and then I got involved in martial arts, and through martial arts, studied under a Buddhist monk and learned about Buddhism. Later, I studied Chinese martial arts, learned about Taoism. So by the time I was 17, I was very interested in Eastern mystical religions. I found them fascinating, far more interesting than Christianity. Christianity to me was extremely boring. So when I went to college at 18 and took a world religion course, because I was interested in learning more about world religions, the professor was an atheist. And he began basically picking apart religions, presenting the atheistic perspective. And I began reading a variety of atheist writers like Bertrand Russell, and really enjoyed what they said. I liked the way they thought. After college, went into the news business, started in radio news, then went into television news, excuse me. And eventually I got a chance to fill in on a talk show while somebody was on vacation, and I found I really enjoyed talking with people. So later I moved to a larger city where I became a newsman, and also became a producer of a talk show. And one of the guests that this talk show host had often was Madalyn Murray O'Hair. Madalyn Murray O'Hair started American Atheist. She sued the government concerning prayer in school, Bible reading in school. Her suit joined with another suit that led to the 1963 Supreme Court ruling that threw out prayer and Bible reading in American schools. So in 1968, that was my first time to talk with her. And never met her, but I talked to her often by phone while we were setting her up to be a guest. And I found that I really liked Madalyn Murray O'Hair's style. I liked how strong she was. I liked how bold she was. She believed the Christians were ignorant, that they were basically stupid, and she made fun of them. And I picked up on that. And eventually, when I became a talk show host, I took on that style. And I mocked Christians, I made fun of them, They would call me up and would get angry with me because of what I was saying about their God, and I would bait them to the point where they would lose their tempers. Then I would hang up on them and just say, well, there's another example of a loving Christian. So that's who I became over time, sort of an angry, mocking atheist. And I really believed it. I loved atheism. Sometimes atheists now ask me, or they'll say to me, the only reason you became a Christian was because you just wanted an easy life. And I told them, no. Atheism is the easiest life I ever lived. Becoming a Christian is the most difficult life I've ever experienced. So how do you go from atheism to Christianity, even to deism or theism? I enjoyed making fun of religious people. And back in the 60s, I had a variety of people on. I had Anton LaVey, who was the high priest of the Church of Satan out of San Francisco. I had him on my show. And he was he was an entertainer. And he was a lot of fun. I enjoyed him. And I had a lot of other people. I had Marxists and I had many Christians on who had sort of odd perspectives, odd views. And I read about a guy who was coming to our town, and he was getting ready to lead a group of people to Mount Ararat to look for Noah's Ark. And I thought, well, here's a good one. This guy I can really make fun of pretty easily. His name is Dr. Henry Morris, and in 1970, Dr. Morris started the Institute for Creation Research. I really didn't know anything about him. I just knew he was some guy who believed that there might actually be an ark on top of Mount Ararat. So I had him on the show, and he had several degrees in science, and he was a professor. And I was taken by the fact that when I would ask him a question, he would have an answer. Most Christians that I would talk to did not have answers for why they believe what they believed. They just believed what they believed, and that's pretty much what they said. They would say, well, the Bible told me so. Well, the Bible says this. Well, this is just what we believe. We have to have faith. But I had not come across a Christian who was able to have a discussion with real answers to real questions. So Dr. Morris and I discussed many things, including a variety of arguments that he was making, including cosmological argument, the teleological argument, the ontological argument, the moral argument, argument from thermodynamics. He had a lot of different science-based kinds of arguments, as well as philosophical. Well, I call that the day that God cracked my armor as an atheist. Something had to begin giving me a desire to learn more, because I really thought that I knew it all. I had another guy on who had a drive-in cinema ministry in our area, and I thought, well, that's odd. Somebody who would have a drive-in cinema showing movies, and he's an evangelist, and he's inviting people to receive Christ. He showed mostly Billy Graham movies back in the late 60s, early 70s. One of the guys that worked with him was a guy by the name of Edward Heinzen. And Dr. Heinzen in 1970 had written a book. I still have a copy of it. It's part of the Baker Studies in Biblical Archaeology. It's called The Philistines and the Old Testament, 1970. So it was interesting to see how God brought people into my life at just the time I needed them. About a year before I met Dr. Morris, I had one day on my radio show said, if God exists, I challenge him to come into my studio. I've got a chair and a microphone right across from me. I invite God to come down and just be interviewed. If you really exist, God, come into my studio, sit down, I'll interview you. And I waited for about 10 seconds, which in radio seems like forever, and began to say, well, apparently God's sick, God's on vacation, he's not interested, maybe he doesn't exist, and in a mocking way. What I didn't realize was that when I invited God into my studio, he did just that. But he didn't sit down himself, he began sending people my way. So Dr. Heinzen and I spent, I guess, probably about 5 months together. Every day after work, I'd go by and to his office, and I would ask him lots of questions. And my questions were very basic to what apologetics are today. And Ed took me through the process of learning about the existence of God from a lot of different apologetic arguments. We spent a lot of time on the text of the Old Testament, text of the New Testament, because he had done his doctoral thesis in archaeology. I asked him a lot of questions about that, and I think that if I could have seen a place along the line where there was no proof for, well, let's say no evidence, no evidence for the text, no evidence for the historical reliability of Scripture, no evidence for the archaeological finds. I think at some point I probably would have just said, okay, it's not there, and I would have moved on. But I just kept seeing the evidence piling up. When I got to the New Testament and looked at both the archaeological evidence for the New Testament, took a look at the textual evidence, came across a lot of the biblical and extra-biblical writings concerning the existence of Christ, his crucifixion, the eyewitness testimony for and belief in his resurrection. These things all came together and mounted up as a very strong case, almost like a cumulative case for theism and Christianity. And one of the things that stood out to me was something in 1 Corinthians 15, where the Apostle Paul, who, according to what I could see in the Bible, was a primary writer of the New Testament. And according to the book of Acts, at least half of the book was about him and his journeys and his missionary endeavors. And he said something in 1 Corinthians 15 that, if the resurrection of Christ is not true, then Christians are to be pitied above all men. And if the resurrection was not true, then Christianity is not true. And I thought about that. I thought, that's interesting that Christianity is falsifiable. It's verifiable and it's falsifiable. And I just found that interesting because I was looking at it from the perspective of a journalist. By that time, I'd been in journalism for several years. I'd covered so many stories. As a journalist, you cover multiple stories a day. You may be on an accident, you may be covering city council, you may be covering a murder trial, and you're using journalistic methods and skills to come to some conclusions about each story so that you can write the story and present the story, whether newspaper, radio, or TV. So everything that I saw as I went along through this process of about 5 months demonstrated to me that Christianity had a very, very strong case. Theism had a very strong case. And one day, one of the guys, in fact, the guy that I had interviewed originally, who owned the drive-in ministry, I went over to see Ed. Ed wasn't there, so I was talking to Terry, and Terry was on his way to supper, and he was closing up his office. And he told me later, he said, Mark, he says, you always came at about supper time, and I always had to stay late for you. He says, so I was somewhat irritated that day. He says, so I just asked you a question. The question he asked me was this. He said, is there any reason why you should not receive Christ as your Lord and Savior? And it's interesting that he used that particular word because as a journalist, you're looking for reasonable evidence. You're looking for reasons to believe something, reasons to ascribe to something. And I paused for a little bit and I said to him, you know what, Terry, I can't think of any reason why I shouldn't receive Christ as my Lord and Savior. And I think I surprised him a bit. He unlocked the door, went back to the office, we sat down, and he just said, tell God whatever is on your heart, whatever you're thinking. And I did, and I received Christ as my Lord and Savior. That was 45 years ago, and that began the process. So, as a journalist, over the last 45 years, I have not stopped looking at the evidence. It's not like, okay, I became a Christian 45 years ago and that's it. I have continued to watch the evidence. There were really very, very few apologists back then. Josh McDowell came along a couple of years later and wrote a book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and I enjoyed that. And Norm Geisler came along, and Ravi Zacharias, and little by little, more and more people have come along. But I continued to watch the evidence, and over 45 years, I've not been disappointed. I have not found evidence that has changed my mind about what I first believed. In fact, the evidence has continued mounting to the point that my belief is even stronger based on evidence. Those of us who are Christians know that there's something that happens when you receive Christ as your Savior. You receive His Spirit, and His Spirit cleanses you from all unrighteousness. And there's something that happens internally that as an atheist I would not have believed, but as a Christian I now have experienced. So I have had both the external evidence and also the internal evidence. And I'm very, very thankful. I believe with all my heart that being an atheist and being saved, becoming a Christian, is all by the grace of God. I give Him all credit. I don't believe that I thought my way or reasoned my way into Christianity. I believe God met me where He wanted to meet me, and He met me in a way that He wanted to meet me. But I believe that He drew me and saved me. And so I'm just so thankful to Him. I enjoy using evidence as a journalist, as a person who needs evidence to be able to do a story. I like the fact that there's plenty of evidence, but I also understand this is a supernatural event to become a child of God. And I just am very thankful for Him and for what He's done for me.
Thank you, Mark. That was great to hear testimonies from all you guys. It's very encouraging to see the work that God is doing all over the world. We had Gunter in Germany, and Liz in Newcastle, and Chris in Canada, and Mark in Alabama there, and Daniel, of course, in London. So quite a wide geographical spread and some really encouraging testimonies.